There's nothing worse than losing a potentially game-winning moment just because you were lagging. So in this video, we're going to talk about optimizing your PC so you can make sure that this never happens to you. And even if you don't have this kind of ugly stuttering and freezing, it's always a good idea to make sure that your PC is running as fast as it can. So let's get into it and start with the simple problems first. The absolute worst performance issues are caused by very common mistakes. If you get constant hitching, stuttering, and freezing, there's probably something very wrong with how your PC is physically put together. So let's start there. First of all, do a quick check of your PC case to make sure that your monitor is plugged into your graphics card and not the motherboard. If it's plugged into the motherboard, your PC won't be using your graphics card at all, and that'll make your frame rate unplayably low and make you wonder why you bought a PC in the first place. Keep your case open because the next step is to make sure that your fans and heatsink are keeping your CPU cool enough. If your CPU gets too hot, it has to slow down to prevent damage. That'll cause a dramatic drop in your frame rate. It can also cause stuttering and freezing. To check your temperatures, you might need to install a program that monitors the speeds and temperatures of your different hardware components. I use a program called Hardware Monitor. All you need to do is run the program, then play a few games. Once you're done, go back into the software to check your temperatures. If your temperatures are displayed in red text or if they get higher than 85 or 90 degrees Celsius, something's very wrong. First, you need to check that your CPU fan is turned on and spinning. If it's not spinning, make sure that it's actually plugged into your motherboard. It should be plugged into the pins labeled CPU fan. If it was already plugged into the correct place, then the problem might be deeper, and it might cost you $5 if you don't already have a tube of thermal paste. A surprising number of PCs are built without thermal paste ever getting applied to the CPU. But before you check, make sure you already have a tube of thermal paste ready to go, because when you take your cooler off your CPU, you always have to reapply the thermal paste. If you don't reapply, you'll have pockets of air trapped between the CPU and your cooler, and that raises your CPU temperatures even higher. If you pull off the CPU cooler and find that there was in fact thermal paste already applied, you'll need to clear off all of the old paste. You can use a Q-tip or a cotton ball, dip it in isopropyl alcohol, and then wipe away the old paste. If you noticed that the old thermal paste was dripping over the edges of your CPU, it means whoever applied it originally used too much. And guess what? That can also make your CPU a lot hotter. You don't need much, just a tiny dot in the center works just fine. Once you've got your thermal paste figured out, the last thing to check inside your PC case is your RAM. If you have 2 sticks of RAM, make sure they're positioned in slots 2 and 4. If there isn't an empty slot between your 2 sticks, your PC might not be running in dual channel mode. And that just means you could have a much higher frame rate in the games you play. And by the way, it's always better to have 2 of the same exact model of RAM. If you have 2 different types, they both will only be able to run as fast as the slower stick. From what I've seen, those are the 3 most common physical issues that happen to new PC players. So make sure that your monitor is plugged into the right place, make sure your CPU cooler is working with thermal paste, put your RAM sticks in the correct positions, and then after this, unless you've done something else very uniquely wrong, you should be ready to start looking at software solutions to get your PC running as fast as it can. The absolute first thing you need to do as a new PC user is make sure your drivers are up to date. Figure out what motherboard you have and install the most recent chipset drivers. Figure out what brand of graphics card you have and get the most recent graphics drivers from their website. That process is as simple as Googling NVIDIA RTX 3070 drivers, or whatever model of graphics card or motherboard you have. Click through the installation process, restart your computer, and you're good to go. Once your drivers are installed, there are some easy ways to boost your performance through software tweaks. Let's start simple with your graphics card settings. If you recently got a new monitor with a high refresh rate, you're going to have to use your graphics card driver software to enable that higher refresh rate. This is what that looks like in the NVIDIA control panel. Use the drop-down menu to select the highest refresh rate available and click Apply. If you don't do this, you won't be seeing all of those extra frames that your monitor is capable of pumping out. The NVIDIA control panel also gives you some ways to boost frame rates and decrease your input lag. In your 3D settings, change your power management mode to Prefer Maximum Performance, turn Vertical Sync off, and turn on low latency mode. There's one Windows setting that might give you another little performance boost. Head into your Windows settings, go to System, Display, Graphics, Advanced Graphics Settings, and turn on Hardware Accelerated GPU Scheduling. One of the last easy things to do is to check to make sure your RAM is running at its advertised speed. Open your Task Manager, go to the Performance tab, then click on Memory. If your RAM speed is slower than the speed printed on its packaging, you absolutely need to fix that. This is slightly more difficult than everything we've talked about so far because it does require you to access your BIOS, but you need to do it. Restart your PC, press Delete or F2 on your keyboard as it's restarting, and that'll take you into your BIOS interface. Depending on what motherboard you have, your UI will look different than the one you see here. There are two things you need to do here. First, make sure you enable XMP profile 1 or 2. Next, find the setting for RAM speed and change it to match the advertised speed of your RAM sticks. You might need to raise your RAM voltage to make this work, but don't go higher than 1.4 volts. Everything I've mentioned so far, besides learning how to navigate your BIOS, it's all pretty easy to do, but there are many other ways to boost your PC performance. However, if you're trying to squeeze that last bit of juice out of your system, you'll be diving into things like registry edits or manual overclocking, and if you don't know what you're doing, those tweaks might actually make your game performance worse. Your PC might start crashing, and it might be difficult to reset everything back to normal. So be careful, don't install anything that you don't recognize. And really, you don't need to worry about crazy tweaks because the thing that makes more of a difference is your actual in-game graphics menu. In pretty much every game, there are certain graphics settings that you need to turn down or turn off to maximize your performance. In all games, things like shadows, reflections, and lighting effects are usually the options that will improve your frame rate the most when you turn them down. I would also strongly recommend turning off settings like post-processing, motion blur, and depth of field effects. To me, it just seems like these settings obscure your vision for no good reason. And if you want to play games more competitively, you really shouldn't be using them. The setting that's most controversial is probably anti-aliasing. Some players love it, but I hate it. To me, it just makes everything look like a blurry mess. Without anti-aliasing, you'll see some ugly, jagged edges, but that's just because you're looking at square pixels on your screen. If you do use anti-aliasing, that smoothing effect will always make it more difficult to spot enemy players on your screen. If you're looking for the most responsive graphic settings, you need to make sure that you're playing in full screen mode instead of windowed mode or windowed full screen mode. It has to be exclusive full screen mode. And also make sure that you raise your frame rate limit to the highest available option. And if you can, make it unlimited. It is always better to uncap your frame rate. I'm sure a lot of you will argue with me and quote other videos claiming that you should use G-Sync and cap your FPS 3 frames under your monitor's refresh rate. I don't have time in this video to explain why that's wrong. I promise that I've tried G-Sync and different frame rate caps, and it's just objectively worse for competitive games. You need to turn G-Sync off and uncap your FPS. You'll get a tiny bit of screen tearing, but what you get in return is so much less input delay. It's a much more responsive experience, and it makes it feel like your reaction time is a lot faster. You might be wondering why I'm recommending uncapping your frame rate. If you have a 144Hz monitor, for example, and you're getting 400 frames per second, it's true that you're not actually seeing those extra frames, but what you do get is a significant improvement to your total input lag. So even if you're stuck on a 60Hz monitor, you'll get a much more responsive experience from capping your frame rate much higher than 60 FPS or just leaving it uncapped. Unfortunately, some of you out there might try all of these tips and still find that your frame rate is dipping uncomfortably low in important moments. That minimum frame rate hurts your gameplay more than anything else, and sometimes there's no way to fix that. And in this case, the problem is just that your CPU cannot keep up. In my experience, it's always the CPU. It's never the graphics card, it's never the RAM, and what sucks is you might have a very fast, very expensive CPU and still have this problem of seeing your frame rate drop so low that you start feeling it. It makes your aim feel sluggish and you lose track of your opponents. And these days it's very easy to buy the wrong CPU for the game you're trying to play. These days, if you want to keep your minimum frame rate high, You don't need a CPU with a fast 5.3 GHz clock speed. You don't need a GPU with 32 cores. You need a CPU with lots of cache. To figure out how much cache your CPU has, open your task manager, click on performance, then CPU. It is very likely that your L1, L2, and L3 cache are all less than 30 megabytes. You could have bought a top-of-the-line i5 14600 CPU, but because that model only has 24 megabytes of cache, your frame rate is still going to drop a lot lower than you want it to. In this recording here, I'm using a budget-friendly PC. The CPU is a Ryzen 5 5600X3D, and the graphics card is an NVIDIA RTX 3060. In Fortnite, my frame rate stayed mostly above 200 FPS, even in the most dense area of the map. In Apex Legends, my FPS was pretty much capped out. It rarely dropped under 250. In Counter-Strike, I always got higher than 350 FPS. It just never dropped. So hopefully this will help you make an informed decision if you decide it's time to replace some of your hardware. This CPU that I was using has 96 megabytes of cache. The nice thing is that you'll be saving money and getting a higher minimum frame rate. And remember, that's what really matters. You could spend $2,000, $3,000 on a 4090 and a 14th gen i5, and you'll get a maximum FPS of well over 1,000, but that doesn't matter when your minimum frame rate is still dropping under 100. I hope at the very least that this video encouraged some of you to take a look inside your PC case, because the easiest way to boost your performance is to just get the dust out. Get some compressed air, get a pipe cleaner, get the dust out of your case. If you look inside and you see any amount of dust on your case fans, your CPU fans, your graphics card fans, all of that dust is slowing down airflow and it's keeping your PC much warmer. I know it can be a bit overwhelming diving into PC hardware and software tweaks, but if you made it this far, you're doing great. Good luck troubleshooting, tweaking, shopping, dusting, whatever it is you decide to do, it'll make you better prepared for the tips in my next video.